You're the only failure in this family, Lewis. Look around this table. Mom and Dad built something real, I built something real. You're still chasing fairy tales like some kind of lost child. My brother Cyrus raised his wine glass, and the entire table erupted in laughter. Aunts, uncles, cousins, they all found it hilarious. I sat there in complete silence, my fork halfway to my mouth, watching 23 family members laugh at my expense during what was supposed to be our annual Thanksgiving dinner. I didn't defend myself. I didn't storm out. I didn't even blink. I just sat there, absorbing every laugh, every smirk, every satisfied glance between my parents. But deep down, I had already made a choice that would change everything. Ask yourself, what if your own family built their entire success on erasing you? Would you scream or would you wait? Let me show you what I did and how silence, when used right, can be the loudest scream of all. 1 week later they lost everything. No empire, no reputation, no freedom. And that night, my mother, who hadn't spoken to me in 6 months, called me in tears. What changed everything wasn't revenge. It was what I uncovered about how they'd been using my name, my identity, my legal signature for years, building their fortune while treating me like garbage. What they never saw coming was that the family disappointment had been paying attention all along. My name is Lewis Thorne, and for 32 years I've been the family's designated failure. Not because I actually failed at anything, but because someone has to play that role in every family dynamic, and I was the quietest, so I got the part. While my brother Cyrus built his real estate empire and my cousins climbed corporate ladders, I chose a different path. I became a freelance researcher and fact-checker, working mostly with legal firms and investigative journalists. It's solitary work that pays modestly but suits my personality. I like digging through documents, finding patterns, uncovering truths that others miss. The family never understood this choice. To them, success meant visible wealth, prestigious titles, and social status. My work was invisible, my income was private, and my lifestyle was simple. This made me the perfect target for their collective disappointment. The Thorne family gatherings followed a predictable script. Cyrus would arrive in his latest luxury car, talking loudly about million-dollar deals and influential clients. My cousins Jasper and Sage would compete to one-up each other with promotion announcements and vacation photos. My parents, Helena and Sterling, would beam with pride at their successful children while treating me like an awkward house guest they couldn't quite get rid of. I lived in a modest apartment in the older part of town, drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, and dressed practically rather than fashionably. This became ammunition for family jokes about my lack of ambition and wasted potential. What they didn't know was that my simple lifestyle was a choice, not a limitation. My work had taught me to be observant, to notice details others missed, to document everything. These skills made me good at my job, but they also made me aware of inconsistencies in my family's stories that others might overlook. For instance, Cyrus claimed to have started his real estate business from scratch 5 years ago, but I remembered overhearing phone conversations about properties and investments that dated back much further. My cousin Jasper talked about his innovative marketing strategies, but some of his original ideas sounded remarkably similar to proposals I'd written for clients months earlier. Small things. Inconsistencies that nagged at me but never quite formed a complete picture. The family had perfected the art of excluding me while making it seem accidental. Important family meetings happened when I was too busy to attend. Business discussions stopped when I entered a room. Investment opportunities were discussed in group chats I somehow never got added to. "Oh, we didn't think you'd be interested," became their standard response when I questioned these oversights. "You're more focused on your research work." They made my exclusion sound like consideration for my preferences rather than deliberate marginalization. It was a masterful gaslighting technique that kept me doubting my own perceptions for years. But the Thanksgiving dinner changed something fundamental in me. Sitting there watching my entire extended family laugh at Cyrus's failure speech, I realized I was done accepting their version of who I was supposed to be. The laughter died down and conversation moved on to other topics: Cyrus's latest property acquisition, Jasper's upcoming promotion, Sage's new investment portfolio. I finished my meal in silence, helped clear the dishes without being asked, and left without saying goodbye to anyone. As I drove home that night, I made a decision that would have terrified the old me. I was going to find out exactly how my successful family had built their empire. And I was going to use every research skill I'd developed to do it. They thought my quiet nature made me weak. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The annual Thorne family Thanksgiving was held at my parents' estate, a sprawling colonial that screamed old money, though I'd always wondered how they'd afforded it on Dad's government salary and Mom's part-time consulting work. The dining room could seat 30 people comfortably, and this year it was full of relatives I saw only during mandatory family gatherings. I'd arrived with a homemade pumpkin pie, which was immediately overshadowed by the catered desserts Cyrus had ordered from some trendy bakery downtown. My offering went unnoticed, eventually forgotten on the kitchen counter while the professionally decorated cakes took center stage. The seating arrangement spoke volumes about family hierarchy. Cyrus sat at my father's right hand, my cousins flanked my mother, and I was relegated to the far end of the table between my great-aunt Cordelia, who was hard of hearing, and my 12-year-old nephew, who spent the entire meal playing games on his phone. Dinner conversation flowed around me like I was a piece of furniture. Business deals, stock portfolios, real estate markets, political connections, topics I could have contributed to given my research background, but no one asked for my input. When I tried to interject with relevant information I'd uncovered while working on economic trend analysis for a client, Cyrus cut me off mid-sentence. "Louis, that's not how the real world works," he said with patronizing patience. "You can't understand market dynamics from whatever blogs you read." I hadn't been quoting blogs. I'd been citing Federal Reserve data I'd compiled for a congressional research project. But pointing that out would only invite more condescension, so I stayed silent. That's when my cousin Sage decided to pile on. "Remember when Louis thought he was going to be an investigative journalist? What happened to that dream?" More laughter rippled around the table. The investigative journalism comment stung because it revealed how little they knew about my actual work. I did investigative research constantly, I just did it for law firms and think tanks rather than newspapers. "Some people are built for success," my mother added with a sweet smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Others are built for different things." Different things. Code for failure. That's when Cyrus delivered his devastating toast. "You're the only failure in this family, Louis. Look around this table, Mom and Dad built something real, I built something real. You're still chasing fairy tales like some kind of lost child." The laughter was immediate and unanimous. Even my nephew looked up from his phone to join in. I counted the seconds, 47 seconds of sustained laughter at my expense. 47 seconds of my entire extended family agreeing that I was the family joke. But as I sat there, something shifted inside me. Instead of feeling hurt or angry, I felt analytical. I found myself studying their faces, cataloging their reactions, noting who laughed the hardest and who seemed genuinely amused versus who was just following the crowd. That's when I noticed something odd. My father's laughter seemed forced, almost nervous. My mother kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read: guilt? Fear? And Cyrus, despite his triumphant toast, kept fidgeting with his watch, a tell I remembered from childhood when he was lying about breaking something. The observation triggered my professional instincts. When people are genuinely confident in their superiority, they don't need to tear others down so viciously. When people are secure in their success, they don't need to repeatedly announce it. This wasn't confidence, this was overcompensation. After the laughter died down, I excused myself to use the bathroom. But instead of going upstairs, I slipped into my father's study. It was a risk. Family members weren't supposed to go through his private papers, but something was driving me to look. The desk was covered with the usual clutter of bills and correspondence, but one folder caught my attention. It was labeled Thorn Holdings LLC in my father's careful handwriting. I'd never heard of Thorn Holdings despite supposedly being part of the family. I opened the folder and found incorporation documents, bank statements, and property deeds. What I saw made my stomach drop. The primary signatory on every document was listed as L. Thorn, but it wasn't my signature. Someone had been signing my initial and last name on legal documents for what appeared to be years. I quickly photographed the documents with my phone, my hands shaking slightly as I worked. This wasn't just family exclusion, this was identity fraud on a massive scale. As I closed the folder and left the study, I realized that the family's casual cruelty had just revealed something they never intended to show me. In their arrogance, they'd forgotten that the family failure might actually be capable of noticing things. I returned to the dining room, finished my meal in silence, and helped clean up without being asked. No one thanked me for the help. No one asked if I was okay after their public humiliation. I was invisible to them, which was exactly what I needed to be. Driving home that night, I felt a calm determination I'd never experienced before. They thought they'd put me in my place. Instead, they'd awakened something in me that they were going to regret. For the first time in my life, I was going to use my professional skills for personal reasons. And they had no idea what I was capable of finding. I spent the weekend after Thanksgiving creating what I call a truth map, a systematic approach to investigating complex situations that I developed for my professional work. This time, the subject wasn't corporate fraud or political corruption. It was my own family. I started with public records, using the same databases I accessed for client research. Property records, business registrations, court filings, all publicly available information that most people never think to check. What I found in the first hour of searching made my earlier discovery seem like the tip of an iceberg. Thorn Holdings LLC was just one of 7 business entities registered under variations of my name. Thorn Enterprises, Lewis T. Holdings, LT Properties. Someone had been very busy creating corporate shells using my identity. Each entity showed significant financial activity, with assets totaling well over $2 million. The property records were even more revealing. That colonial mansion my parents lived in? It was owned by L. Thorn Enterprises, with the mortgage signed by someone claiming to be me. My brother's self-made real estate empire was built on properties held by Lewis T. Holdings. Even my cousin's investment portfolios appeared to be funded through various LT entities. I cross-referenced the signature dates with my personal calendar and found that several major documents had been signed by me on days when I was out of town for work. One particularly large property acquisition was signed on the day I was in Seattle researching a corporate litigation case for a law firm. I had hotel receipts, airplane tickets, and phone records proving I was 2,400 miles away when I allegedly signed a $800,000 purchase agreement. But the most chilling discovery came when I accessed my credit report. Not only had my family been using my name for their business ventures, they'd been doing it so systematically that my credit score reflected financial activity I knew nothing about. Loans, credit lines, and investment accounts, all established using my social security number and forged signatures. The scope of the fraud was staggering. For at least 5 years, possibly longer, my family had been using my identity as a financial foundation for their success while simultaneously treating me as the family disappointment. The cognitive dissonance was breathtaking. They needed my legal identity to build their empire, but they despised my actual presence. I spent Monday morning calling the contact numbers on various business documents. Using my professional voice and claiming to be conducting due diligence for a potential investor, I was able to gather additional information about the Thorn family business network. What I learned was that my family had created an elaborate shell game. Money moved between the various L. Thorn entities in complex patterns that would be difficult for casual observers to follow. Property was purchased by one company, then leased to another, then sold to a third, all technically involving my legal identity, none involving my actual knowledge or consent. The investigation took on a momentum of its own. Each document led to 2 more questions. Each phone call revealed another layer of deception. I'd stumbled into the kind of systematic financial fraud that typically made headlines when federal prosecutors finally unraveled it. By Tuesday afternoon, I had enough evidence to fill a 3-inch binder. Forged signatures, fraudulent business registrations, identity theft, tax evasion, the list of potential criminal charges was extensive. But I wasn't ready to take action yet. I needed to understand the full scope of their operation and, more importantly, I needed to understand how deep the deception went. Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected phone call that changed everything. "Is this Lewis Thorn?" the caller asked. "This is Janet Kellerman from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. We need to discuss some irregularities in business filings associated with your name." My blood went cold. The family's fraud hadn't just escaped my notice, it was under federal investigation. And because they'd used my identity, I was the person the IRS wanted to talk to. "I think there may be some confusion," I said carefully. "I'm not involved in any business operations." "Ma'am, we have records showing you as the primary signatory on multiple business entities with combined assets exceeding $3 million. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss these holdings." After setting up an appointment for the following Monday, I hung up and stared at my phone. The family fraud was about to become a federal case, and I was the person whose name was on everything. That night, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I wasn't going to protect them. I wasn't going to cover for them. I wasn't going to continue being their unwitting accomplice while they treated me like garbage. I was going to tell the truth. All of it. But first, I needed to build an airtight case that would protect me and ensure they faced the full consequences of their actions. They'd made one crucial mistake when they decided to use my identity for their empire. They'd chosen to defraud someone whose job was finding the truth. Thursday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I wasn't actually ill, but I needed uninterrupted time to build the most important case of my career, the case against my own family. I started by creating a secure digital archive of everything I'd discovered. Multiple backup copies stored in different locations with timestamps and metadata intact. If this was going to federal court, the evidence needed to be bulletproof. The hardest part was obtaining writing samples for handwriting analysis. I needed proof that the signatures on the business documents weren't mine, which meant collecting samples of my actual signature and comparing them to the forged ones. Fortunately, my meticulous record-keeping habits meant I had years of signed receipts, contracts, and other documents that could serve as authentic samples. I also needed samples of my family members' handwriting to potentially identify who had been forging my signature. This required more creativity. I spent Friday afternoon at my parents' house, ostensibly helping my mother organize old family photos. While she worked in another room, I photographed handwritten letters, shopping lists, and notes I found around the house. The comparison was revealing. While none of the forged signatures were perfect matches for my family members' normal handwriting, several showed characteristics consistent with my brother Cyrus's writing style. The L in Lewis had the same distinctive loop he used when writing C for Cyrus, and the pressure patterns were similar to his natural writing. But I needed more than handwriting analysis. I needed to trace the money. Using my professional database access, I began following the financial trail. Money flowed into the L. Thorne entities from various sources: real estate sales, investment returns, consulting fees, then flowed back out to accounts held by my family members. It was money laundering on a sophisticated scale, using my identity as the central hub. The most damaging discovery came when I traced the funding source for my brother's real estate business. His self-made success was built entirely on capital that had been fraudulently obtained using my name. Every property he'd purchased, every deal he'd celebrated, every dollar of profit he'd made, it all traced back to financial instruments established using my forged signature. My parents' colonial mansion, my cousin's investment portfolios, even the catered Thanksgiving dinner that had been the setting for my humiliation, all of it funded through identity theft. Saturday morning, I drove to my grandmother's old house, now owned by my Aunt Cordelia. Grandma Iris had died 3 years earlier, leaving behind boxes of family documents that no one had bothered to sort through. With Aunt Cordelia's permission, I spent the day going through old papers, looking for anything that might be relevant. What I found exceeded my expectations. Grandma Iris had kept meticulous records of family finances, including copies of her will and trust documents. More importantly, she'd kept carbon copies of correspondence with family members about various financial matters. Among these papers, I found a letter from my grandmother to my father, dated 6 months before her death. "Sterling, I'm concerned about the irregularities in the trust paperwork you've submitted. Lewis's signature appears to have been copied from the birthday card he sent me rather than signed in the presence of a notary as required. If you're attempting to modify the trust distributions without her knowledge, this constitutes fraud and I will have no choice but to report it to the authorities." The letter was never sent. I found it in an envelope that had been sealed but never mailed. Grandma Iris had died of a sudden heart attack the following week, and the letter had been forgotten among her papers. But it proved that the identity theft had been going on for at least 3 years, possibly longer. It also suggested that my grandmother had died knowing about the fraud but had been unable to stop it. Sunday evening, I received a call from Janet Kellerman at the IRS, asking if I could come in earlier than scheduled. "We've received some additional information that changes the scope of our investigation," she said. "Can you be here tomorrow morning at 9? "Of course," I replied. "Is there anything specific I should bring?" "Any documentation you have regarding your business activities." "And Mr. Thorne? You might want to consider bringing legal representation." After hanging up, I spent the night organizing my evidence into a comprehensive presentation. Financial records, handwriting analysis, property documents, correspondence, everything needed to tell the complete story of my family's systematic fraud. As dawn broke on Monday morning, I felt a strange sense of calm. For 32 years, I'd been the family disappointment, the one who didn't measure up to their standards of success. In a few hours, they were going to learn that their success had been built on the foundation of the person they'd dismissed. The irony was almost beautiful. They'd used my identity to build their empire while treating me like I was worthless. Now my identity was going to be the key to bringing their empire down. I dressed professionally, gathered my evidence, and drove downtown to the federal building. It was time to introduce my family to the consequences of their choices. The IRS meeting was both better and worse than I'd expected. Better because Agent Kellerman immediately understood that I was a victim rather than a perpetrator. Worse because the scope of the federal investigation extended far beyond what I'd discovered on my own. Mr. Thorne, Agent Kellerman said as we sat in her austere office, we've been tracking irregular financial activity associated with your name for 8 months. The entities using your identity have been involved in tax evasion, money laundering, and securities fraud. We estimate the total financial impact at over $4 million. $4 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. However, she continued, your cooperation in this matter could be crucial to our investigation. Based on the evidence you've provided and our preliminary investigation, it appears you've been the victim of an elaborate identity theft scheme perpetrated by your own family members. I spent 4 hours in that office, going through every document I'd collected, explaining the family dynamics that had made the fraud possible, and providing a detailed timeline of my movements that proved I couldn't have signed the documents in question. Agent Kellerman was particularly interested in my grandmother's unsent letter and the handwriting analysis I'd conducted. This level of systematic fraud typically requires inside knowledge of the victim's personal information, she noted. Family members are perfectly positioned to commit this type of crime because they have access to social security numbers, bank account information, and personal history. By the end of the meeting, I had agreed to serve as a cooperating witness in the federal investigation. In exchange, I received immunity from prosecution and assurance that I wouldn't be held financially responsible for the fraudulent activities conducted using my name. But Agent Kellerman had one more surprise for me. Ms. Thorne will need to execute search warrants on your family members' properties within the next few days. We wanted to give you advance notice in case you preferred not to be present when arrests are made. Arrest. The word hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. When? I asked. Thursday morning. Simultaneous raids on 5 properties, including your parents' home and your brother's business offices. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to decide how I wanted to handle the final confrontation with my family. I could have simply stayed away, let the federal agents handle everything, and watched from a distance as my family's world collapsed. It would have been the safe choice, the easy choice. But it wouldn't have been satisfying. Instead, I chose to orchestrate one final family gathering. A gathering where they would learn the truth before the federal agents arrived. I spent Tuesday and Wednesday making phone calls. I've been doing some thinking since Thanksgiving, I told each family member. I'd like to have everyone over for dinner Wednesday evening. I have something important to discuss about my future plans. The responses were predictably condescending. Cyrus assumed I was finally ready to get serious about joining the family business. My parents thought I might be announcing a career change or engagement. My cousins probably expected another opportunity to mock my life choices. None of them suspected that the family failure had spent the past week dismantling their criminal empire. Wednesday evening, I prepared dinner for 15 people in my modest apartment. It was cramped, but that was part of the plan. I wanted them to be physically uncomfortable, packed into my small space, reminded of how they'd always seen my home as inadequate. They arrived in their luxury cars, wearing expensive clothes, carrying themselves with the confidence of people who believed they were inherently superior to their host. Cyrus made jokes about slumming it in my neighborhood. My cousin Sage commented on how cozy my apartment was, using the tone people reserve for things that are disappointingly small. During dinner, conversation followed the usual patterns. Business successes, investment strategies, social connections, all the topics that reminded me why I was supposedly the family failure. I listened politely, nodding at appropriate moments, playing the role they expected me to play. After dessert, I stood up and tapped my wine glass with a fork. Thank you all for coming, I said. I wanted to gather everyone together because I have something important to share about my future. The room fell silent. All eyes were on me, waiting for whatever announcement would finally prove I was ready to join their world. Over the past week, I continued, I've been conducting some research into family finances. You know how I love digging through documents and uncovering information. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Yes, quirky Lewis and his research obsession. What I discovered was fascinating, I said, reaching for the folder I'd placed on the side table. It turns out that my name has been associated with quite a few business ventures over the years. Ventures I somehow never knew about. I began laying out documents on the coffee table. Business registrations, property deeds, bank statements, all bearing my name, none bearing my actual signature. The laughter died away. The comfortable family atmosphere shifted into something colder. Lewis, my father said carefully, what exactly are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Dad. I'm stating facts. For at least 5 years, Members of this family have been using my identity to establish businesses, purchase properties, and move money. It's identity theft on a sophisticated scale. My brother Cyrus leaned forward. That's ridiculous. You're reading too much into standard business documentation. Am I? I pulled out the handwriting analysis I'd commissioned from a professional forensic specialist. These documents show that someone has been forging my signature on legal papers. The forged signatures show characteristics consistent with your handwriting, Cyrus. The room was completely silent now. I could see my family members exchanging glances, trying to figure out how much I knew and how much damage I could do. But here's the really interesting part, I continued, pulling out my final piece of evidence. Yesterday, I met with Agent Janet Kellerman from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Apparently, the federal government has been investigating the L. Thorne business entities for 8 months. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. Thursday morning, I said calmly, federal agents will be executing search warrants on your homes and businesses. You'll be arrested on charges including identity theft, tax evasion, money laundering, and securities fraud. The explosion of voices that followed was immediate and cacophonous. Denials, accusations, threats, pleas, everyone talking at once, nobody listening. My cousin Jasper actually stood up and pointed at me, shouting something about family loyalty and betrayal. I waited for the noise to die down, then spoke one final time. You spent my entire life telling me I was a failure. You mocked my work, excluded me from your successes, and treated me like I was worthless. But your entire empire was built on my name, using my identity, stealing my legal existence. I paused, looking around the room at their shocked faces. Tomorrow morning you'll learn what failure actually looks like. Then I walked to my front door and opened it. I think it's time for you to leave. Thursday morning came gray and cold, fitting weather for watching an empire collapse. I didn't go to the federal building to watch the arrests. I didn't need to see my family members led away in handcuffs to know that justice was being served. Instead, I went to work, returning to the quiet research that had always been my refuge. But by noon my phone was ringing constantly. News travels fast in small cities, and the arrest of a prominent local family on federal fraud charges was front-page material. Reporters wanted statements from the whistleblower brother. Former clients of my brother's real estate business wanted to know if their transactions were legitimate. Friends and acquaintances who had never paid much attention to me suddenly wanted to understand my role in the scandal. I declined all interview requests and referred legal questions to the federal prosecutor's office. This wasn't about publicity or revenge, it was about truth and justice. The full scope of the fraud emerged over the following weeks as federal investigators unraveled the complex web my family had constructed. The final tally was staggering: over $5 million in fraudulent transactions, dozens of forged documents, multiple counts of tax evasion, and evidence of money laundering that spanned 3 states. My brother Cyrus, as the apparent ringleader, faced the most serious charges. His real estate empire collapsed overnight when authorities froze all assets connected to the fraudulent entities. Properties were seized, bank accounts were locked, and his business partners distanced themselves as quickly as possible. My parents lost their colonial mansion and faced charges for their role in facilitating the fraud. The investigation revealed that they had been complicit from the beginning, providing family information and access that made the identity theft possible. My cousins Jasper and Sage, who had benefited from the fraudulent investments, were charged as accessories and faced significant financial penalties even if they avoided prison time. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of their downfall was how quickly their social circle abandoned them. The same people who had laughed at my expense during Thanksgiving dinner now crossed the street to avoid being associated with the Thorne family scandal. Cyrus's wealthy friends, my parents' country club associates, my cousin's business contacts, all of them vanished the moment the arrests made headlines. The federal investigation also uncovered the true scope of my grandmother's knowledge. Among her papers, investigators found evidence that she had been planning to expose the fraud herself before her death. She had been collecting documentation and preparing to contact authorities when her heart attack intervened. This discovery led to one final twist. My grandmother's will had contained provisions that would have transferred significant assets to me if any family member was ever convicted of fraud involving my identity. She had somehow anticipated this exact scenario and had built in legal protections that no one had noticed until the federal investigation brought them to light. Within 6 months, I found myself the beneficiary of properties, investments, and assets worth nearly $2 million, money that had rightfully belonged to me all along, given that it had been accumulated using my identity. But money wasn't what mattered most to me. What mattered was the validation, the proof that I hadn't been crazy to notice inconsistencies, the confirmation that my quiet observations had been accurate all along. I used the recovered assets to establish the Iris Thorn Foundation, named after my grandmother, dedicated to helping victims of family financial abuse and identity theft. It seemed fitting to transform their fraud into something that could help other people in similar situations. The foundation's first case involved helping a young woman whose parents had been using her social security number to establish credit cards and loans since she was 16. Her situation was remarkably similar to mine, a family scapegoat whose identity was being exploited by the very people who claimed to love her. 6 months after the arrests, I received a letter from my mother. She was writing from federal prison, where she was serving an 18-month sentence for her role in the fraud conspiracy. "Dear Louis," the letter began. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell you that I understand what we did was wrong. We told ourselves we were just using your name on paperwork, that it wasn't really hurting you since you weren't involved in the business side of things. But we were lying to ourselves. We were stealing from you and we were stealing your identity and we were doing it while treating you terribly." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing regrets and apologies that felt genuine but came too late to matter. She ended by saying she hoped I could someday forgive them, not for their sake but for my own peace of mind. I never responded to the letter. Forgiveness might come eventually, but it wasn't required for my healing. The truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and I had built something meaningful from the wreckage of their crimes. A year later, the Iris Thorn Foundation had helped dozens of identity theft victims, most of them people whose own family members had betrayed their trust for financial gain. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that my previous research projects had never been. I had also begun speaking at legal conferences about family financial abuse, sharing my story as a case study in how sophisticated fraud can hide behind family dynamics. The presentations were well received, and several law schools had asked me to guest lecture on identity theft investigation techniques. My old life as the family failure was completely gone, replaced by a new identity as an advocate for fraud victims and an expert in financial crime investigation. The skills that had made me good at research, attention to detail, persistence, methodical analysis, had turned out to be exactly what was needed to fight the kind of crimes my family had committed. 2 years after that Thanksgiving dinner where my brother had called me the family failure, I was featured on the cover of a legal journal as one of the country's leading experts on family financial fraud. The article detailed how I had uncovered and exposed one of the most sophisticated identity theft schemes in recent federal court history. I keep a copy of that magazine cover in my office, not as a trophy but as a reminder. A reminder that truth has a way of surfacing, that quiet observation can be more powerful than loud proclamation, and that sometimes the family failure is actually the only family member with any real integrity. My family thought they had erased me while building their empire on my identity. Instead, they had created the exact person who would eventually bring them down. The family scapegoat had become their worst nightmare, someone who noticed everything, documented everything, and refused to stay silent when the truth needed to be told. They lost everything because they never understood that the person they dismissed as worthless was actually the most dangerous person they could have betrayed. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They were wrong. Silence, when used strategically, can indeed be the loudest scream of all. Have you ever experienced family members who took credit for your work or used your identity without permission? How did you handle discovering that people you trusted had betrayed that trust? Share your experiences in the comments below. Remember, documentation is your best protection against any kind of fraud, especially when it involves people close to you. Trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, and never be afraid to investigate inconsistencies you notice. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for your daily dose of chilling revenge tales where justice finally prevails.